Mr Chair, I rise to speak to Clause 2 in respect of the commencement, and also want to speak to Brendan Horan's amendment, which tries to tackle a challenge that is presented with an international organisation making decisions about when things come into force, and tries to align New Zealand's decision-making with that. I wish to speak in favour of the current arrangement in the legislation on the strength that it permits the government to bring legislation into line as the process naturally runs its course. I think Mr Horan raises a valid point, so I'm not suggesting that he's not raising a point worthy of debate, because I think it is worthy of debate. But I think on balance, it's important to give the government that flexibility. Our real beef is with removing the further consideration from the legislation of important issues, and that is updates to the articles that will in future be made by regulation. And I'd be very interested to hear the government take a call on why it's not interested in having the proper parliamentary scrutiny over those articles. And I'm sure the Minister and the Chair will leap to her feet shortly and engage passionately in this debate, because I've seen her following the issues closely and nodding as the points have been made by the opposition. So I think she's considering those issues, and I do look forward to her response, because it is a serious issue that has been raised, and parliamentary scrutiny is something that we should not let go lightly. And what we're talking about here is legislation that relates to approximately 1.8 billion New Zealand dollars, Mr Chair. This is legislation which we're debating in the House, and we're giving the proper parliamentary scrutiny, but I think it pays to remind ourselves that this is actually a considerable sum of money and a considerable investment that New Zealand makes in its relationship with the IMF. We shouldn't forget, we shouldn't trivialise this, because we largely agree on the principle of supporting the IMF, and we certainly as Labour and national parties have agreed by and large that that the IMF should exist in order to promote economic growth that's sustainable. And I took the government to task in my earlier address about whether it's really meeting those obligations, whether it really is addressing the balance of payments problem that we have as a country. The IMF projects it to be the worst in the developed world in the current year, and this government has as yet shown no leadership on addressing that problem. So that those concerns remain. But when we are talking about 1.8 billion New Zealand dollars, Mr Chair, I think it is worth saying, when should this come into effect? What is the proper process for this legislation to come into effect? And it seems to me that the provision in this part of the legislation is in fact adequate. The subclause that says the Act comes into force after the date on which it receives royal assent is, except for provided in subsection 2, is an attempt to make sure that those things which need to come in immediately can come into play. And the second subclause, which comes into force at a date appointed by the Governor-General by Order in Council, is an attempt to deal with those things that don't need to come into effect immediately, but can come into effect later, as and when needed, to line up with the international decision-making process. So on the surface, this seems like a very sensible commencement clause, notwithstanding the issues that Mr Horan raised. And so, Mr Chair, Labour will be supporting this clause, as indeed it is supporting the whole bill, because it does support the purposes of the IMF around economic stability, around meeting that balance of trade issue around making sure that there is sustainable economic growth in countries, something New Zealand unfortunately isn't modelling at present, but which we believe would be of value to all countries, because all countries growing can provide the necessary services to their citizens that make them able to maximise their potential. So Labour will be supporting this. We question the government's record on some of these issues, but we support the intent of this legislation, which is to meet our international obligations on this matter.
The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to reiterate